I'll start by saying a few things about Bolshevik feminism in the 1920s, especially the work of Alexandra Kollontai, who was possibly the most famous and still is Bolshevik feminist in that time. Alexandra Kollontai also founded Zhenotel, the women's department, and had close connections with the Bolshevik state, with Lenin, has had conversations with Lenin. Kollontai was concerned, especially in the work that the women's department was doing at the state level, with what was called the woman question. And so what was the woman question in the revolutionary years? The woman question was how to get women involved and participate in the revolution. So we can think about the goal of Zhenotel as a state hierarchical organization that comes from the center, from Russia, to all of the other parts of the Soviet Union at the time. The women's department sent women's councils to the republics and also to other regions of Russia. And the goal of these councils was to bring, especially in the republics, to bring women out of their backward traditional cultures. So what did the women's councils do in Armenia? Veronika Zablotsky has written a little bit about this. The women's councils were trying to get women to understand that they were free. They were trying to get them to understand that they didn't have to live in the conditions in which they were living. So on the one hand, this is a very empowering project. On the other hand, it was in some ways had a colonial gaze. So women coming from the center of the Soviet Union, we could use the word empire, although I prefer not to use that term in this context. Coming from the center, Russia, to all of the other republics, to empower women and to liberate women. Another thing that Zhenotel and Alexandra Kollontai, specifically as the founder, was interested in doing was to make women a part of public life. The kind of analysis that Bolshevik feminism has of public and private and women's roles within private and public is one in which bourgeois culture keeps women in private space. One thing that Alexandra Kollontai writes about extensively in her writings, in her work, is the way in which what is privatized reproductive labor needs to be turned into public productive labor. So if the seclusion of women, if the privatization of women is problematic for various reasons, because women are secluded, because women don't consider themselves valuable parts of society, and also because that kind of labor is done in the home, it remains secluded from public life, and therefore it becomes devalued by public life. The work that gets done in the home is not seen as valuable as the work that's done outside of the home, for instance. They aimed to make everything that was privatized public, and that means making everything that's considered reproductive labor productive labor. So what would it take to make something that was reproductive labor productive labor? For instance, childcare, which is traditionally in bourgeois culture reproductive labor. It's the labor of reproducing, not just giving birth to children, but also disciplining them, reproducing the next generation, and so on. How to make that into production. So this means making all of that public. So instead of women caring for disciplining children in the home, in the privacy of the home by themselves, this is work that would be done in public, within a public space, in daycare centers, for instance, and the work that gets done for the reproduction of children, for the disciplining of children, is work that would be paid for by the state. In terms of other kinds of labor that women did within the home, that was a part of reproducing labor. Instead of women cooking and preparing food by themselves at home in private, that would be work that would be done in public spaces, in cantinas, in cafeterias, connected to workspaces. So this is all something that we can call state feminism. Of course, the term feminist was not in circulation at the time, but this is what we might now term retrospectively state feminism. So what do we mean by state feminism? We mean that feminism becomes the project of the state. The state is the one that brings empowerment to women from the top down, includes women, allows women's participation from the top down. So the state was the one tasked with the liberation of women from private homes and into public space where their labor would become more valuable. The state here is what Kollontai and Lenin and others, of course, refer to as the dictatorship of the proletariat, meaning that the state, which is in some ways at the time was authoritarian, it had a center, and that center acted, and its actions spread across the republics, across the Soviet Union. Big part of Bolshevik feminism is the understanding that in order for that project to move forward, in order for the revolution to actually be complete, women had to participate in that revolutionary process. But a major kind of criticism that we can kind of approach all of this with is that it prioritized the public and deprioritized the private, because in order for them to liberate women from public space, they also believed that private space was a less valuable space. The thing that I find most interesting is the sexual politics of Bolshevik feminism, especially the way in which it becomes so radical, and the ways in which the women that we're talking about, the feminists that we're talking about, Alexander Kollontai, Clara Zetkin, who's at the time working in Germany and is also in close contact with Lenin, the way in which they even resist the main kind of dismissal of sexuality that exists within the higher-ups of the Bolsheviks. So there's various conversations that take place with feminists at the time, with Lenin himself, that come up against Lenin's dismissal of sexual politics. One very interesting figure in these debates is Clara Zetkin, and she's especially interesting because of a conversation that is recorded between her, recorded and then transcribed in the fall of 1920 with Lenin. And in this conversation, Zetkin comes up directly against Lenin, who is dismissing the concern around sexuality, the concern around sex for these women's councils. She argues with him that women are talking about sex, and this is very important because it has a huge impact on how we continue to do a revolutionary analysis in a very Marxist tradition. For Lenin, the discussion of sexuality at all is a bourgeois concern. He brings up the Freudian obsession with sex. He accuses Zetkin, he accuses these women for continuing to be obsessed with sex. He refers to their discussions of sex as a bourgeois survival, a cultural survival of bourgeois society. And for Zetkin, as well as other Bolshevik feminists, as well as socialist feminists at the time, the concern with sexuality is not at all bourgeois, but is quite radical. And the concern with sexuality, where sexuality comes from, the kind of liberation of women and everyone from a kind of Puritan concern of morality, where sexuality is a private matter and should not be discussed publicly. So this question around sexuality and whether or not it can be part of a revolutionary conversation, whether it has any part in the revolution at all, is a problem that we see come up very frequently in leftist discourse. So for Marxist-Leninists, the thing of ultimate concern was class struggle, and anything that remained outside of class struggle, anything that was placed outside of that was a distraction from the revolution. Bolshevik feminists were very much within these kinds of debates, and they kept insisting that sex and sexuality were of utmost concern, that these concerns had everything to do with class struggle and everything to do with revolution. Many of them, especially Alexandra Kollontai, proposed some very interesting and radical ways to move forward to have a revolutionary sexual practice. What does sexual desire itself look like in communism? What does it look like in an actual revolutionary movement? In a very interesting letter that she writes to the working youth in 1922 called Make Way for Winged Arrows, she differentiates what she calls winged arrows from wingless arrows. She refers to these kinds of radical practices of love and sexuality as love comradeship, and she argues that sexual desire can be the beginnings of forming revolutionary love. For her, this notion of love comradeship that she coins has everything to do with loving not only an other, but loving an other as the beginning point of loving the collective itself. Her analysis of bourgeois love is that by secluding love, it also privatized women, and it made the relationship between men and women unequal, in the sense that women became dependent on men. It became women's obligation, in some ways form of survival, to marry men in order to be able to survive. She refers to this as wingless arrows, in a way a kind of eros that is castrated in some ways. She proposes winged arrows instead. In winged arrows, all love relationships are comrade relationships, including the love, desire, romantic, sexual relationships between two people. They must be based on equality. They must be based on revolutionary beliefs. And they must be mutual. In some ways, she's proposing another understanding of communism where the basis of social practice is the general love of all people. Stalin was very much obsessed with sexuality. There were a lot of things going on in terms of sexuality in Stalin's years, especially in the 1930s. In some ways, Stalin's project to clean up the cities of prostitution, to clean up the cities from all of these distracting practices that muddled the minds of the youth, that muddled the minds of women. All of these kinds of practices took advantage of all of the major transformations that were taking place during these years. For instance, this was also a time in which homosexual subcultures were thriving. Many historians often write about the Stalin repressive years as having completely wiped out homosexuality, especially from the cities, or having sent it completely underground. Of course, homosexuality was criminalized in the 1930s. But in some ways, because of the ways in which the cities were being built at the time, it also created a lot of new public spaces in order for homosexual subcultures to thrive. World War II is also an interesting time to think about this project of what we might call state feminism, but I also want to suggest that we refer to it as state paternalism instead. Is that women were being given access and advantages in some spheres, especially militarized spheres, such as the Air Force, advantages over men. So like a kind of positive discrimination of sorts, affirmative action, in order to get women, again, to participate equally, to be able to be a part of the socialist revolution going forward. The discourse of women's emancipation, women's liberation becomes almost becomes really scarce in Stalin's years. And so what you see is, especially in higher up society within the Communist Party, the development of groups of women who are basically what we can call housewives, who understand their labor for socialism, for communism, as the creating a good home, a good life for their laboring husbands, and this kind of stuff. And this is stuff that really does exist in the public sphere. The development of women's journals that are largely about how to make a good socialist home, how to prepare good socialist meals, how to be equal to your husband in order to be able to have good conversations with your husband. And so these kinds of things. So Stalin, in some ways, created opportunities for women by way of state paternalism, the giving to women from the state down, and in some ways also got rid of all of the really radical elements of Bolshevik feminism. While we can talk about sexual egalitarianism throughout the rest of the Soviet years, in some ways that kind of radical feminism of the Bolsheviks won't return. It kind of gets lost in history.